LocalBozo.com is thrilled to have with us as our guest for an exclusive interview, executive producer of SiriusXM's The Howard Stern Show, and recently accomplished author Gary Baba Booey Dell'Abate. Gary, thanks so much for giving us a couple minutes today. How you doing today?
Good. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing good, thanks. So how did the idea to write They Call Me Baba Booey come about?
I was out pitching another book around. I was pitching a book of like rock and roll trivia lists, arguments, discussions, et cetera. And I got some lukewarm response to that. But then I spoke to a book agent, and he said, "Well, that's probably not the book people want. People want your story." And he said, "What's your story?" And I was like, "Well, I don't have a story." But of course, I knew I did have a story. I just wasn't sure that I was willing to tell it. So I thought about it. I mulled it over because a lot of it had to do with the way I grew up. My mom and she suffered from mental illness. And I spoke to, my brother, my mother, and my wife. And I sort of came to terms with the fact that maybe this would be an interesting book to write. And so that's how it sort of came about.
Well, I can tell you firsthand, I got my copy of the book last night, and I could not put the thing down. I got through about 200 pages, and without sounding too cliche, I laughed my ass off. I got choked up. But mostly I was just fascinated by your life. How difficult was it for you to put some of these incredibly emotional experiences into words?
Putting them into words wasn't as difficult as making the decision to do it. Once I made the decision to do it, it was easy. But I will say it was a difficult decision whether I wanted to move forward and write the book. Do I want to open my family up, to this, their privacy being lifted? And so that's why I wanted to make sure everybody was on board with it, and everybody was.
Was there anything specifically in the book that you had to discuss with your wife Mary or your kids prior to writing about? Any real revelations for them?
It was interesting. There were a couple of different things. I sort of, in the book I talk about my mother had suffered from mental illness, and my kids really didn't get to see a lot of that, although they always, had an idea that grandma was a little bit different in some ways. And so I had to sort of sit down and talk to them about some of that. The other thing that was interesting was, there's a chapter in there. I had a brother named Stephen who died, of AIDS in 1991, and that was a very emotional chapter for me to write because I never really told that story from beginning to end to anybody but my wife. So while I've had friends and people who know parts of the story, writing the whole story out was difficult. And so we had told both my kids, some years ago that Uncle Stephen had died of AIDS, and because they learned about it in school pretty early now. But my wife said to me a couple of months ago, she says, our younger son Lucas, she goes, do you think he knew your brother was gay? And I'm like, I don't know. So I was in the car with him one day, and I said, hey, did you know that Uncle Stephen died of AIDS? And he goes, I do know that. I go, you know that he was gay? And he's like, no, I didn't know that. And then we discussed it a little bit. It was fine, but sometimes you take for granted what kids know, and they don't know everything. So those were the couple of things that I had to discuss with everybody.
Well, let me tell you, it was just as emotional to read it as I'm sure it was to write it. I also think the format of the book is great. It jumps back and forth from you growing up in your home life to some of the more iconic moments from the Stern Show, and it's not a typical straightforward autobiography. Was that your intention, to keep readers interested all the way through?
Well, of course, any book you write, you want to be interested. But, my real intent was to sort of tell my story and sort of, intertwine it with stories from the show. But stories from the show, they had to be relevant. I wasn't going to start crowbarring stories in for no good reason. So the first pitch, the videotape, how I met Howard, those are stories that make sense to put in a book. If I started telling stories about, one day I met Paul McCartney, that to me would seem gratuitous. So I don't think, for me, I wanted to sort of tell everybody how I made it to the show and some of my experience on the show without being gratuitous, and I think I accomplished that.
I definitely agree. I think it works. Now, as executive producer, would Gary Dell'Abate have been booked to appear on the Howard Stern Show to promote They Call Me Baba Booey?
Well, I would have had to read the book, and then I would have had to gone through and got some stories. So I think he would have been booked on the show. I'd go in and I'd go, listen, Howard, this guy that's working the radio show is available. Here's a couple of things we could talk about. We could talk about that first pitch. I think that's an interesting story. But maybe I might not have been. I don't have any really good sex stories. I haven't dated any celebrities. Maybe I wouldn't get on the show.
Where would you say that writing this book ranks on your list of career accomplishments?
Writing it ranks up pretty high. How it fares will make it rank a lot higher. And it doesn't. It's not necessarily a financial thing. I mean, of course, I hope this book sells really well, because financially it'll be great. But I think I'd be really bummed out to have put all this effort into it and not to have it be successful.
Now, it looks like you have a pretty extensive book tour ahead of you throughout the month of November. Are you truly ready for the rabid Stern fans that are going to show up at these things?
Yeah, because I used to do an appearance almost every other weekend for almost 20 years. So I've always sort of been in touch with the rabid Stern fans.
Okay, fair enough. Well, with fewer than 30 shows remaining in the future of the Stern Show still unclear, as executive producer, which guests do you regret never having had on the show?
Madonna. I would have liked to have Madonna on the show. I would have liked to have Bill Murray on the show. I almost had him on a couple of weeks ago, and I still think I can get him at some point. Those are two that jump out at me. And not like Madonna's the be-all, end-all. I just think she'd be an interesting guest. I think her and Howard together would be very interesting. And then, listen, I'd love to have Kathy Lee on for obvious reasons.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that'd be insane. All right, last question. I got to ask you, gun to your head right now, where will Gary Dell'Abate be working come January?
Gary Dell'Abate in January will be working somewhere with Howard Stern. I just don't know where that is.
Fantastic, man. Thank you so much for your time. The book is a great read for any fans of Gary himself or The Stern Show. You can order your copy of They Call Me Baba Booey, which comes out tomorrow, at Amazon.com. Here in New York, you can catch Gary tomorrow night, November 2nd at 7 p.m. at the Barnes & Noble on 17th Street, and November 3rd at 12:30 at the Borders on Wall Street and Broadway. For more information on all things Booey, check out bababooey.com. Gary, thanks so much for giving us some time today, and best of luck with the new book.
Hey, man, thanks so much for your time.